Everybody, I just wanted to check in with you now that we are halfway through Unit 1. I have gone through the introductions on the discussion board, and I've really enjoyed reading your thoughts on history and historical thinking in the What is History discussion. So I've added to both of those discussion forums, posted some questions as well. One thing to keep in mind as we continue our work, and hopefully this is something we can talk about a little as we all turn to our first posts on Twitter and Hypothesis, is the relationship between primary and secondary sources. Um, so we have to always keep in mind the reality that the historical record is always incomplete. There are always going to be gaps in what we know because of the relative lack of records that exist. Even for some of the most well documented events, things like the Manhattan Project, for example, because they're more recent, because it was a government project, and so there was tons of documentation. Even people who had misgivings about it, who were involved on the project internally, wrote down their own ideas and thoughts about that. So we get a lot of different perspectives. Sometimes, though, we won't get certain perspectives, or because we haven't asked the right questions about the project yet, we might miss things that actually played a big role in that story. Something that has kind of recently come to light in terms of the Manhattan Project is the impact that it's had on local communities, the impact that it had at the time on local communities, as well as what its impact has been since the 1940s. So, again, we should always ask ourselves as well, who is not being represented here? With primary sources, we should always think about what specific perspective are we getting from this person's account, whatever version of a primary source we might be looking at, and what else might we look at to better contextualize this person's account and get a fuller picture of the past. For the reasons that I'm sort of hinting at, not kind of saying directly, primary sources often have more biases than secondary sources. And so I want us to realize the term bias, I think, sometimes carries a negative connotation. For history and the study of our past, it just is. Because we're human beings, we all have our own biases, whether or not we are fully aware of them. Sometimes there are things that we might change about the way we look at the world once we receive new information, but they're there. And they're there for the people who created primary sources from hundreds of years ago, or from a couple of years ago. So we have to ask again, what are those things? What stake do these people have in telling this story? And what else do we need to know so that we can get a fuller picture of this account? Secondary sources, if they're done well, if they ask good questions, and if they're thoroughly researched, can do that work of providing that bigger picture for us. And so that's something we have to keep in mind as we think about the relationship between those two types of sources. Looking ahead to the second half of Unit 1, of course, I alluded to our work on Twitter or Hypothesis. You can choose Hypothesis if you'd like not to be on Twitter, or vice versa. I do suggest looking into both if you don't have experience with either. Reach out with questions that you have as you get started. Social annotation is a great way for us to get into our initial conversations about the past in terms of the readings that we're going to be doing. So there's that. If you opt for Hypothesis, I strongly suggest that you still create a Twitter account and look into what's going on there, because that's a place where we're able to post more informal kinds of links to current events or things that are relative to New Mexico history, and it's harder to do that with Hypothesis. And so I don't. I like to share those things with the class quite frequently, and so I don't want you to miss out on that, even if you're going to choose not to do the annotations there, if that makes sense. We're also getting a start with our timeline on Tiki-Taki. I know several of us have already posted there, and things look like they're off to a pretty good start. If you're able to, please try to get that work done ahead of the weekend just in case there are any issues so that I can help out. The way I work my schedule, I tend to work during the days, some evenings during the week, but not much at all on the weekend in general. So I'm happy and I will get back to you about any questions or concerns you have as you're working on the class on Saturday and Sunday. But just know you probably won't hear from me till Monday morning, and you'll have to um, incorporate that feedback, and we'll resolve those things then. So I think that's all I wanted to mention. I hope you're having a good Martin Luther King Day, and I will talk to you again soon.